Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar. It's Vacant to Vibrance, how to turn your vacant lots into vibrant plots. I'm Jen Hawes, Partnership Manager at Island Press, and I'm excited about today's valuable conversation with our knowledgeable panel. Our goal today is to inspire you and equip you with new equipment and tools to implement transformations in your neighborhood. If you have questions during the webinar, please put them into the questions box in the webinar panel to the right of your screen. We will share your questions with the panelists at the end of the conversation. The webinar today is being recorded, and we encourage you to share this free and educational content with anyone that might find it useful. We'll send you a link to the webinar recording in the next few days. You can also access all of the speakers' presentations in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel. When the webinar concludes, we'll ask you to fill out a brief survey. Your answers will help us to continue to provide these free webinars to the public, so your honest input is very valuable. The webinar today is brought to you by ioby and Island Press. Island Press is an environmental nonprofit book publisher. Founded in 1984, Island Press began with the simple idea, knowledge is power. The power to imagine a better future and find ways for getting us there. The mission of Island Press is to elevate voices of change, shine a spotlight on critical issues, and focus attention on sustainable solutions like we're doing today. The Urban Resilience Project, part of Island Press, is also helping to bring you this webinar today. Each year, the team creates a free compilation of short-form articles that advance holistic, transformative thinking and action in an era of climate change. With a lens on equity, this year's compilation is available for you today. Check out Resilience Matters for an Island Press. Let me click on that slide. Check out the free resource here. And ioby, which stands for In Our Backyards, is also bringing us this webinar today. ioby helps to grow and implement great ideas one block at a time. The crowdsourcing platform at ioby connects leaders with funding, resources, and support to make our neighborhoods safer, greener, and more livable and more fun. ioby believes that it should be easy to make meaningful change in our backyards, the positive opposite of NIMBY. ioby is committed to building the capacity of residents to organize resources, financial, volunteer, and social from within their own neighborhoods. If you have an idea for a project that you'd like to fund with ioby, you're encouraged to go to ioby.org/idea, and an ioby staff member will follow up with you there. I'd like to share with your excellent panel today. The webinar was inspired by the book Vacant to Vibrant, Creating Successful Green Infrastructure Networks by Sandra Albro. If you'd like to get a copy of the book, we're offering a special 20% discount for webinar viewers. Just use the webinar code or Vibrant at islandpress.org/book/vacant-vibrant. Sandra Albro is our first panelist, and she's our moderator today. She is a research associate at Holden Forests and Gardens. She investigates how improving soil and plants can boost the ecological and social value of vacant lots in Great Lakes cities. She is project manager for 2 projects that test low-cost, low-maintenance urban greening projects that manage stormwater and revitalize communities in Gary, Indiana, Cleveland, Ohio, and Buffalo, New York. Ms. Albro also serves as co-chair of the Cleveland Tree Coalition, a group of more than 40 businesses, organizations, and branches of local government that are working to implement the Cleveland Tree Plan. And Sandra is also on the board of the Doan Brook Watershed Project. Sandra will present and act as moderator. Louise Bruce is a strategic planning and food waste management consultant and a community organizer. In 2009, she transformed a vacant lot with her Kensington, Brooklyn neighbors into a thriving community composting program and a native plant garden. She later worked with the New York City Department of Sanitation to implement the nation's largest municipal food and yard waste recycling program, serving 3.5 million residents and advancing the city's climate change agenda. In Virginia, she led an unprecedented mobilization of the grassroots to support congressional nominee Leslie Cockburn and championed a strong environmental platform. She holds a BA from Cornell University and a Master's of Urban Planning from New York University. Joe Rashid is ioby's Detroit Action Strategist. He has spent his career in Detroit's nonprofit sector, primarily in Southwest Detroit and Brightmoor neighborhoods, working to empower and provide resources to local residents. His work is driven by the belief that community development is not a career choice, but a way of life. Joe believes that there is not a more innovative and creative city in this country than Detroit, and he loves aiding others to discover how to turn their great ideas into realities for its community. A native Detroiter who has lived in 10 different zip codes in Detroit, Joe currently lives in East English Village neighborhood with his wife Dana and their 2 dogs, Roscoe and Peaches. I will now hand it over to Sandra to get our conversation started. There you
go. Okay, thank you, Jen, for that introduction. So I will be talking about Vacant to Vibrant, the project that inspired the book. Vacant to Vibrant is a project that was supported by the Great Lakes Protection Fund. And it went officially from 2011 to 2017. However, the sites still exist, so we continue to learn lessons about the factors that make sites long living as they continue to be maintained. Let's see here. Okay. Inspiration for Vacant to Vibrant came from our urban agriculture work study program, Green Core. So in the 20-year history of Green Core, we've seen how transforming vacant lots into urban green space and community gardens, market gardens, has helped transform communities. And that got us thinking about other ways that we might be able to use vacant parcels in ways that are maybe, not as labor intensive as urban farming, but that could still provide environmental and community benefit. For the Vacant to Vibrant project, we were specifically interested in these small vacant residential and commercial properties that tend to be interspersed among houses and buildings in various states of occupancy. These tend to be the hardest places to figure out how to use because they're small, they're disconnected, they come into existence at different points in time. It can be different to string them together. And this was the type of vacant space that we were interested in experimenting with specifically. At the start of our project, we were pretty open-minded about environmental benefit, but at the time, in around 2010, cities in the Great Lakes region were particularly focused on stormwater management as an environmental issue of concern. The 3 communities that we ended up working in, again, those were Cleveland, Buffalo, and Gary. All of those are combined sewer communities who are interested in stormwater management, specifically to alleviate combined sewer overflow. So we are interested in incorporating stormwater management into all of our installations. And also because of the types of communities where these small vacant lots exist, many of these communities have seen disinvestment for decades. A lot of them lack access to safe and clean parks. And so we were interested in adding a recreational overlay to the stormwater management to provide amenities to the community that we're missing. And then also it's just kind of a test to see, how many different types of land uses can you put into a small vacant lot, and can they coexist, and can they add value to each other? And maybe by combining different types of land uses, can we get to a point where maybe these vacant lots would not be redeveloped, or not all of them, but they would be preserved as green space into the future. So the way that we went about choosing sites was a little bit different than what often happens. We started at the extent of the entire city and looked at all the vacant parcels. So in Cleveland, at the time, there were about 25,000 vacant parcels available in theory for a vacant land use project. So we went through this thought experiment. How do you work from that full extent of vacant land into choosing parcels that are specifically good for the type of project that we were interested in? So at the level of the city, we were just looking for areas where stormwater management was needed, where there were neighborhoods that were in decline, but that still had enough people in them to benefit from a recreational use or from a vacant land project. And so in Cleveland and Gary, the communities that we worked in were about 60% occupied. And that was a little bit more in Buffalo. And we were also looking for places that had indicators that green land use was possible and desired and sustainable. Then once we whittled it down to neighborhoods of interest, we looked at places where we could access vacant lots, where there was community interest in a vacant land reuse project. And again, we were looking specifically for neighborhoods that lacked park space where amenities would be used and appreciated and valued. Finally, once we had neighborhoods of interest, we worked down to block groups and parcels by looking at all of the different physical and social characteristics that would go into a vacant land project for stormwater management and recreation. So for example, we looked at soils, we looked at ownership, we looked at surrounding occupancy, et cetera. And here are examples of what we did. So on this parcel in Gary, we worked with the city of Gary. They had hardest hit funds to demolish houses. So in Gary, we had the benefit of working throughout the demolition process and then straight into green infrastructure. So this particular house in Gary had been vacant for a number of years before our project, and it sat at a prominent corner as you entered the neighborhood of Etna. And so we worked with the community and decided on a welcome sign. So it's hard to see from this angle, but there were 5 signs that spelled out the neighborhood name of Etna, and each of those was located in a rain garden. And this simple neighborhood sign just really reflects community pride and was an interesting project that continues to last to this day. Again, underlying each of our projects, there were stormwater management features that it varied. This particular project had 6 different little rain gardens or bioretention cells. Some of the other projects only had 1 or 2. This is another parcel in Gary that we worked with the city on. They provided the demolition funding and support, and then we provided a plan for green infrastructure later. On this parcel, this shows the benefit of getting to work throughout the demolition process. Is in the back of that house that had been burnt was a really beautiful decorative cinder block wall. And so under normal circumstances, that wall would have been demolished, but because we were able to work with the city in advance, we asked for the wall to be retained. And then there were already gardens in a patio that the wall enclosed. And so we converted those to rain gardens, added some rain garden in the front to capture additional runoff. And then also provided support for picnic tables that could be added to this site on request. Here's an example of a vacant parcel in Cleveland where there was a lot of requests for recreational use, particularly for small children. And so on this parcel, we added a swing set, a park bench. Here, the rain gardens aren't as prominent. They're located more in the back. So the focus of this parcel was really on providing some recreational use for a neighborhood that didn't have a park. In Buffalo, there were also a lot of requests from the community for more active play sites. And in Buffalo, handball is a popular sport. So we constructed a handball court in the back of this parcel. And then in the front, we added picnic areas. And then you can also see the rain garden here in the very front of the parcel. It's difficult to tell, but in some of these parcels where there's a rain garden in front, the whole parcel sloped into the rain garden. And that was one of the selection criteria that we looked at for sites too, was there a prevailing slope where it would be easy to direct stormwater runoff into a rain garden feature. Another site in Cleveland. Here, the neighbors were not as interested in park space. These tended to be more older residents, single homeowners on this block that didn't have as many grandchildren or children of their own. And so they were just interested in adding beauty to their neighborhood, maybe some value to their homes. And we had talked about adding a park bench here, and the park bench even seemed a little bit rowdy for this particular street. So we didn't even add a park bench. It just had birdhouses and native plant gardens. In Buffalo, this was another prominent corner site that asked for a little bit more to activate the site. So here we added pervious parking, off-street parking for the adjacent rental homes, and then we added a pervious pavement walkway around some lawn and simple gardens. I do want to say that the average cost of each of these projects was about $18,000 for installation costs. So we were trying to keep it reasonable and replicable in different neighborhoods. But the flip side of that is, it's $18,000. So these aren't necessarily like the most beautiful park spaces ever, but we were really trying to hit that sweet spot of what is practical and reasonable, affordable for communities and easy to maintain so that these spaces would last into the long run. And then lastly, in Cleveland, also to address requests for more recreational space, we created a nature play site. So we were interested in nature play as an alternative to more traditional park spaces. For nature play sites, we could repurpose materials. It adds a little, provides some imaginative play opportunities for children. And nature play was something that we have experimented with here at the garden, specifically with our Hershey Children's Garden, and found to be pretty popular. So I'm just going to skip then to the lessons learned from our project. I want to start with the nature play site. One of the unanticipated things about nature play in this particular context was that repurposed materials and more natural elements are sometimes, difficult in this context to separate from some of the other problems that vacant lots encounter. So our play log, ended up looking quite a bit like maybe fallen trees that might persist on a vacant lot for a number of years. The play mounds even looked a bit like some of the uneven demolitions that are characteristic of some of the older parcels in our neighborhoods. And so for the nature play site, we did end up backtracking on a lot of these design elements and moving more toward traditional swing set and play equipment at the request of the community. With this and some of the other active play sites, again, one of our questions was just whether recreational use and stormwater management could coexist within a pretty small area. For active play sites, that question is still being worked out. Kids were running through the rain garden quite a bit. Somebody in the neighborhood ended up uprooting the plants in the rain garden, I think because of a perception that maybe they interfered with the play or maybe they were dangerous to children. And then the active play sites also attracted quite a bit of trash that was a challenge for maintenance contractors. So that's just something to keep in mind about active play as a land use. Some other lessons learned, of course, you all know that maintenance is hard. Even thinking about maintenance in advance and working sometimes with maintenance contractors during the design process, we still found that a lot of native plants created a messy looking environment that was difficult for landscape contractors to sometimes maintain, and then also difficult for residents to embrace. I highlight safety here because safety was a real concern of the residents that they talked about a lot through the design process. We didn't have issues with safety on our sites after they were constructed, and that's pretty consistent with research that shows that bringing good uses onto vacant parcels can reduce some of those other unintended negative uses. And because particularly in the active play sites, sometimes durability was a problem. So durability of our signage, of our solar lighting, and some of the other elements. I talked about the low costs of our projects. This highlights like a give and take between what residents want is they want sites to look really nice and show that people care and invest in the neighborhood. They want them to look neat, and that can pose a challenge for maintenance, of course, and for your budget. One of the solutions that we found to help balance resident needs with budget and maintenance requirements is that reducing the number of species on each site and then maybe increasing, biodiversity across sites helped provide a tidier appearance that might address some of those concerns. Also, simplifying the layout, so clustering species into clumps or rows and then providing frames like a border, also gave residents more that appearance that people were caring for the site, and it didn't look quite as messy to them. And one of the last things I'll talk about with relation to this project is just keeping costs competitive and the importance for that, and discussing that specifically for our green stormwater infrastructure, but also vacant land use in general. So in Cleveland, one of the things that, one of the give and takes between green infrastructure is always gray infrastructure and the affordability and certainty of gray infrastructure. So in Cleveland, they might use a price point of about 75 cents per gallon of CSO treated. And we found it useful to talk about our project in those same terms to provide an apples to apples comparison. So our green infrastructure cost about 58 cents to 1.95 per gallon of CSO treated. And just even expressing those costs per gallon helped us talk directly with people who are advocating for more gray infrastructure. And then in the interest of time, I'll just wrap it up. I will say that there continues to be a need for landscape level planning that can help us position green space in places where it can help address concerns for equity and climate resilience. During the question and answer period, if folks are interested, I could talk very briefly about a separate ioby project that I did that provided free trees to residents in Cleveland as part of our work on the Cleveland Tree Plan. But for now, I'll turn it over to our next panelist.
And Sandra, sorry, you mute yourself real quick, sorry. Could you address what CSO is? Someone had a question on that.
Sure. CSO is combined sewer overflow. So in combined sewer systems, both sanitary flow and stormwater flow or street flow go into the same pipes. And that means the pipes can become overwhelmed during stormwater events like rainfalls or snow melts. And when that happens, in order to relieve pressure on the system, then untreated water is discharged straight into waterways rather than going to treatment plants.
All right. Hello, everyone. This is Louise, and I'm going to share the story of Compost for Brooklyn, a vacant lot project in a neighborhood called Kensington, Brooklyn. So let me see here. So I suspect that many of you are joining because there's a vacant lot on your block or in your neighborhood that just is on your mind constantly. And for me, that was this lot. So in 2009, I moved to this neighborhood in Brooklyn, and I would walk my dog 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a day past this lot at the end of my block, and it just took over every thought, every space in my mind. I was completely obsessed, and I would talk about it constantly. I would talk about what we could do with it constantly. And finally, some colleagues of mine and friends said, stop obsessing and start doing. So we tracked down the owner of the lot using city-provided maps, and were able to persuade him of our vision to use the space. And so what was that vision? Our vision was a community composting project that accepts food scraps from our neighbors and then turns those food scraps into compost that could be used to ameliorate the soil within the lot itself, but then also for street trees and neighborhood gardens throughout Kensington. We also wanted to have a native plant garden and use the plants really as a demonstration of why composting was so important. So to have these healthy, thriving plants would then in turn help people understand kind of the full cycle of their food scraps were going in and then growing a beautiful garden. We wanted it to be a volunteer-run community space that everyone in the neighborhood felt ownership over. And then oh shoot. Do you want to turn yours on? Is my audio working now? Sounds like it might.
Oh, it might be. Yes, I think it is.
It is, okay.
Yes,
Sorry about that. Sounds like my audio went out, but hopefully you were able to glean the vision for the space from this slide. And then the graphic to the left is sort of a bird's eye view schematic that we put together. So just after 2 growing seasons, we transformed the lot into this beautiful space here. And I like to emphasize that this couple is sitting not 10 feet from 3,000 pounds of decomposing food waste. So just to point out that you can compost our food scraps without odors and pests in dense urban areas if managed properly. This is just another shot of the lot, just 18 months into our work. So going back to day 1 in the lot, this is a picture of when we first opened it up. It actually looks cleaner than it did before we talked to the owner about taking it over. It was actually a dumping ground. I remember seeing people throw couches over the fence and garbage bags. And he kindly cleaned it up sort of initially for us. And I just like to tell the story of our first days in the space because looking back, I learned so much from this project. It really influenced my career and the work that I do with community groups. But I think most importantly, it really showed me how important it is to work in a collaborative fashion with your community on projects like this. And in the first early days, I found myself digging up rubble, as you'll see in later photos, and beginning to figure out to process how we were going to transform this space. And there was one hot day when I noticed a woman kind of peeking out her window in the neighboring house, and she kept peeking out and peeking out. And I waved to her, but didn't get a response. And then at about lunchtime, a little girl brought over a plate of home-cooked Pakistani food and a water bottle and said to me, my mother had a dream that this was going to be a beautiful space, and we want to help make that a reality. And then it was sort of in that moment that I was struck that I was obsessed with this space, but so were all my neighbors, and I wanted to figure out how to get them involved. So I'm just going to run through quickly a few of the lessons learned on our end, and then happy to deepen the discussion in the Q&A or following this webinar. The very first thing was how to, as I said, bring in our neighbors. So we were working in this space that's surrounded by a chain link fence. How do we make sure that people know that we're open and we want you to come in? And so some things we learned were to have the space open and have the gates wide open as often as possible, no matter the season. To put a welcome table outside the garden, and if you can, have planters, and ultimately put a street bench outside the garden. I can't tell you how many times our plants were stolen out of the outside planters, but it still felt to us as a community group that it was really important to have them there and continuously replace them, because eventually, we were sending the message that this is not just a garden behind a gate. This is not the secret garden. This is your garden. This is your space. Clear, welcoming, and handmade signage on the fence, I think, is really important. And if possible, making sure those signs are in multiple languages. I don't know why it took us so long to figure this out, but a combination lock instead of a key is critical. We ended up passing around a key for ages, and it felt, it created that kind of secret garden ownership feeling that we didn't want. And ultimately a combination lock was much more inviting and accessible. And then a shed to lock up tools is really important, because if you're going to be open, you want to make sure any of those sharp tools are behind. In this case, could be good to have a key to that lock. I wanted to show you this because this drove me crazy in the initial days of transforming the space. This was the rubble I dug up on just from the surface of the garden, and it drove me crazy. And I looked at that and I kept thinking, how am I going to get rid of this? What am I going to do with it? And then very shortly into opening the garden gates, the neighbor walked by and he didn't see a pile of rubble. He saw his path. And so again, sort of this idea that your neighbors are incredibly invaluable. Having different people's eyes on things can kind of transform how you see the project, how the project evolves. In our case, our neighbors provided translations in multiple languages, from Urdu to Russian to French and Creole. We had graphic designers make beautiful marketing materials that you will see in later slides. Everything, down to cooking and woodworking. I mean, it turns out that just within a few blocks of this space, we had almost every skill set you could imagine. And I wish, if there was anything I could do from day one, it would be some kind of asset mapping or intentional process of helping, identify what our collective skill sets were. But engaging volunteers, we learned a lot about engaging and retaining volunteers in this process. So as I said, we had a lot of people really step up and offer entire programs, like children's nature journaling as a class over an entire summer. But for most volunteers, people really wanted to give, but it was overwhelming to think about like a larger program that they would offer, or a role they would take on, because they have a lot of other things going on in their lives. And so I learned very quickly that when someone would stop by, my initial reaction was like, "You're an artist? Would you like to be our artist in residence? You're a graphic designer. Would you like to be our creative director and webmaster?" That wasn't always effective. It was sometimes, but for most people, it became very quickly very overwhelming. And so we needed to create a ladder of engagement. And what we ended up doing was asking volunteers to commit to just one shift per month. And in exchange for that one shift, during which they would accept food scraps from the public and maybe chop up some food scraps like these young ladies are doing here in the buckets, or begin the composting process, turn some composting bins. We found that in exchange for that, they would receive a t-shirt and some compost. And it was like that sort of very foundational, easy entry opportunity then led to people becoming leaders in the garden and ultimately taking on increasing amounts of responsibility. This is really important, leveraging free resources. We found that there are a lot of incredible programs out there, from ioby to groups that will give you salvage building materials, groups that will provide technical support, fundraising support, etc. And it took a lot of our time to discover those resources. So for those of you on this webinar who are calling in from cities or institutions that want to help facilitate this work, I think just the simple act of figuring out what those resources are in your city and putting them, or county, and putting them in one central place is a huge step for anyone working on a vacant space. And then sort of most importantly is engaging the community. So we did a lot of different programming, as you see here, from panel discussions to workshops about herbs to workshops about native plants and composting. And I think what we tried to do, or what we learned, was that it really depended on the programming, really reflected who was most active in the garden at the time. And so it evolved over time, whereas with a nonprofit, you might have a set mission or a set program that you want to accomplish every year. In our case, we really changed it up, and we found it was very effective to change it up based on who had the most time in a given season. This is to talk about sort of the partnerships we developed. So we started making a lot of compost and partnered with a group to do street tree care throughout the neighborhood, cared for almost 70 trees in one day, I remember, as part of this project. And then collecting data. So Sandra referenced this a little bit, but I think figuring out how to show your impact can be very motivating to volunteers and participants. It also strengthens your project's narrative and funding applications, but it can be very, very difficult for volunteer-run organizations to figure out what data they should collect and how to maintain those records. And so I think, again, that's another area where we can provide more support, helping projects really demonstrate their impact. And then I think I'm running a little over time, so I just want to highlight the notion of celebrating together. We did a lot of block parties and celebrations, and highlighting achievements. And I think that really brought this element of fun to the project. So fun is infectious, and I think you can bring together lots of different groups if that's a focus and an element of your work. And this is the project today. If you'd like to get involved, it's now, we like to say, in its third generation. I haven't been involved actively in quite a while, and there's an incredible group now who are taking it over, and they're focusing a little less on compost and a lot more on gardening with children in the neighborhood. And it's now called Newkirk Community Garden. Thank you.
Great. Joe, if you're ready, feel free. Let me know if you got the presentation.
All right. Hey, everyone. How are you doing? So I'm Joe Rashid. I am a Detroit Action Strategist with ioby. So ioby is a national nonprofit crowdfunding platform, but we are more than just a crowdfunding platform. We do what we call is crowd resourcing. So we're committed to positive neighborhood-led change around the country. And so crowd resourcing is resource organizing plus crowdfunding and really plus technical assistance, especially in the cities that we're on the ground in. And so we are on the ground in Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and Memphis, as well as in Brooklyn, New York. We are on the ground in cities that have experienced heavy disinvestment to really help navigate resources that might be a little bit harder to access and help train people on how to actually get crowdfunding. So what types of projects do we support? We support projects that take place in a leader's neighborhood, have a public benefit, a benefit to your neighborhood's community or local environment, and produce tangible, measurable results. So ioby has raised over $6 million through over almost 2,000 projects to date, with a median donation size of about $35 and trained almost 20,000 leaders here. In Detroit, we've raised about $279,000 in 3.5 years we've been on the ground here in Detroit, trained almost 2,000 leaders, and again, with the same median donation size. So again, kind of reiterating, it can happen at a project level, just could be a single lot. It could be a neighborhood level where you're engaging your entire community in it, on a personal level, or even a civic level where you're addressing something citywide. So today I'm going to talk about a few different projects. So first of all, how to get involved is you can go to ioby.org/idea and you can start a project, and one of our success strategists or action strategists, if you're on the ground in a city, will get back with you and help you get going on that project. So the first case study I'm going to talk about is Lolly to Lovely. Lolly to Lovely happened in the Bagley neighborhood in Detroit. It is a really awesome project because it was just, in some ways it was so simple, but it was, so transformative to this neighborhood at Lolly and Klinger on the city's northeast side. So the one thing I really love about this is that the use of emojis. I mean the pictures in this really I think like tell the story really well. So this is one of my favorite pictures, and thinking about it, so this is a lot that had a ton of illegal dumping that just consistently kept happening. It was on a main safe route to school that children going to the local Davison school would walk by every single day on their way to school, and it was really frustrating every single day to see this happening. Now this is a situation where the neighbors just decided to come up with a solution. They didn't really ask for permission from the city. It would probably taken a lot longer to be able to do, but they built planter boxes just on the berm of that street where dumping just kept happening all of a sudden. And yeah, maybe they had a little bit of dumping here and there after, but pretty soon people stopped dumping because they saw these planter boxes with perennials, and it was really great to see what Julie George and her neighbors were able to do through that. And so that was a really great, tangible way where they were just able to say enough is enough and actually raise just over, right around $1,500 to be able to make that happen. Bagley Community Pocket Park, Samoy Smith is amazing. You know, she was a stay-at-home mom of 3 kids that was homeschooling her kids. And she saw this vacant lot across the street. She saw that none of the kids in the neighborhood were actually coming out to play. And so what could she do to change that? She went to her neighborhood association, but the neighborhood association was worried about liability issues. So she decided to just go for it and start her own nonprofit, Creating Space Detroit. And so what she did was just, you know, got control of the lot, leveraged different resources. And this is, you know, a project that, you know, not only, you know, did she use ioby to fundraise about $4,500, but she, $2,500 rather, but she was able to, you know, bring in other partners from the neighborhood. There's a local university in the neighborhood. There's other partners, and start building this park. So they put up a pavilion, a fire pit, you know, and all of a sudden the kids started coming out playing and getting involved. And the great thing about using crowdfunding as a mechanism is she wasn't asking for a grant where she wouldn't necessarily have to talk to anyone. She was actually talking to her neighbors and engaging with them and building a community around this. And so then she went from just building this beautiful park to there was a house next door that she was able to get. So she initially purchased this lot from the land bank, and we helped her navigate that process through it. And then after that, she was able to then go and acquire the house next door, which she's using as a community house. So, you know, so scaling that project up, looking at how that is. Not everyone wants to be scaling up and you know, growing bigger as an organization, but Samoy did. And I think, you know, she's been able to make a huge impact on her neighborhood, in the Bagley neighborhood on the northwest side of the city because of that. The next one I'll talk about is building a brighter Ninus. This is a project I've worked on for with the Ninus school community for over 10 years, so much before I was at ioby. And at that time, there was you know, 3 burned out vacant structures on the site. This is the last of them. Sorry, it's a little bit older of a picture, but they were able to you know, the parents of the children who went to school, this is right across the street from Ninus Elementary, and they were able to go downtown, advocate for this house to come down, and were able to get it down. After that house was down, the property was owned by the Detroit Land Bank, and they were able to navigate the process because the next door neighbor was able to buy this lot as a side lot. So that was the quickest way to acquire that land. And then they started, they partnered with University of Michigan Dearborn education department to get the kids to actually plan what they wanted to see. The parents wanted another parking lot, but that's not what the kids wanted. And this was really about the kids and getting them to learn how to do this themselves. So they were able to take 3 vacant parcels and turn it into a soccer field, outdoor classroom, you know, they put up picnic tables. They really made it into a really vibrant outdoor space for the kids. So the kids built their own park benches to put in the park. So they learned carpentry and how to do that, and you know, place them out there. They put up small art posts to put their art up in the park, as well as build their own Gaga pit. I guess it's a newer sport that's come about, but it's less violent form of dodgeball that really makes things happen. So it's a really great way to see how they've been able to make that happen. So they raised about $5,000 through ioby, but then one of the guys in the neighborhood worked for a landscaping company that donated sod, and they were able to leverage all sorts of different resources just by making sure that they were talking to the neighborhood about this project. And so it was really an amazing thing to show how they were able to, you know, take this lot and really turn it into this really beautiful space. So here are some of the social media handles for ioby. On Twitter, you can find us there, Facebook, or at In Our Backyards on Instagram. And here's my contact information. So with that, I think we're gonna open it up to questions.
Okay, thank you. So we do have a few questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you could submit that via the question feature. One of the first questions is from Michelle Catapodes. I apologize if I botched your last name. And she asks, I understand the desire to provide open space / green space in areas lacking it, but what are the long-term goals for these lots? To remain as green space, or once the economy improves, would infill housing be preferred? I will answer for my project first, and I'll turn it over to the panelists. The desire for our project was mostly to build a case for projects like this, and then to let that sort out whether residents wanted, the projects that we built to survive in the long term. I think we were trying to move towards some direction where on parcels that were identified as areas that should remain as green space in the future, that we could identify some potential land uses that would be appropriate for that. But in Cleveland, I just heard 3 weeks ago that there will be infill housing in the neighborhood that we worked in Cleveland, and that 2 of the parcels will be converted from the installations that I showed you to houses. Louise or Joe?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think this was a really interesting question that came up early in the conversations with the landowner, because in our case, he wanted to hold on to this lot for potential future development. And the idea of a garden or a community group establishing itself on the space was really scary to him. It felt like that's someone just taking his land without purchasing it. And so we really, sort of discussed the sort of tension between, is this a temporary project or a permanent project? And we went with the idea that, having this space for a year even would make a huge difference to all of us, and being able to work as a community together there temporarily was very valuable. But I will say, it's still, it's been almost a decade and he hasn't asked for the space back, and it remains a garden. That doesn't mean it won't ever change. But I do think in talking to landlords and approaching landlords, especially in very dense urban areas, it just is a consideration whether you're talking to them about a temporary use or not. And one more thing I will say is there's some very cool projects that are thinking about vacant spaces as temporary, and they're developing even planters or different pieces of the garden that can be easily moved out and moved into another vacant space, so that you're not losing out entirely on any kind of investment in materials.
So then one of the next questions is, and we get this a lot, so could we just talk about ownership of the parcels that we're working on? So in Cleveland, Gary, and Buffalo for Vacant to Vibrant, the ownership varied among the 3 cities. In Cleveland and Gary, we were working on city-owned parcels. And then in Buffalo, we were working on parcels owned by a community organization, People United for Sustainable Housing. And what we found is that the owners of those parcels, it's easiest to hold them accountable for maintenance in the long term, just because of how liability works. But like in Cleveland, there's not that infrastructure in place for the city to maintain a lot of vacant land use projects. So Louise, who owned the parcel that you worked on?
In our case, the lot was owned partly by a doctor, and he had multiple properties in other areas. So we actually had to work with him. That did bring up, to your point, all the maintenance was put on us. So we had to take care of the space. He was not responsible for, so the agreement was we would take care of the litter that accumulated outside of the space. He did require us to get insurance, and ultimately we ended up doing it, I believe, through our fiscal sponsor, which was the Open Space Institute. They provide really great support for community projects like this in terms of fiscal sponsorship and insurance.
Okay, and then there's a question here about negative feedback. So this is a great question. We always get negative feedback also, and like to highlight the positive. But yeah, I'll start by saying that we did get negative feedback from neighbors for a variety of reasons. So sometimes just the neighbor, like was an older person who was living next to a swing set and didn't like the noise and the children and preferred the quietness of a vacant parcel. And those types of disagreements can be difficult to resolve when we have neighbors all around the site asking for a place for their kids to play, but yet you also have this neighbor who has to live next to it. And then we also, so that was a little bit more difficult to figure out how to take action on. For the nature play site that I highlighted, we did get a lot of negative feedback. It was pretty overwhelming, and we ended up working with the neighborhood to come up to a solution, and we ended up modifying the site. So Joe or Louise, do you want to talk about what happens when you get negative feedback about a project that you want to do good for the neighborhood?
So, a lot of times when I'm working on a project and I find that there's some negative feedback around it, I sit down with the person. I try to understand what their concerns are and figure out, are there ways to meet that person in the middle? Is there something that they really want to see happen that's not happening? And are there ways to incorporate it? I think that, it's really important for voices to be heard, but, also, are there ways to turn that negative into a positive? Is there a way to help build, and strengthen that relationship? And so I think, it's really important to make sure, there's always those people in the neighborhoods that are just that negative person that just wants to be negative. But is there a way to really change that narrative and figure out how to get them engaged and involved? It doesn't always work, but I think it's really important to make sure that, a lot of times the person just wants to feel heard, and, being able to connect with them in whatever ways possible, I think is really important.
Yeah, I think that's really right. I would add that so two times that sort of pop into my head. One was that I learned to compost at Compost for Brooklyn. I had taken the Master Composter course in New York, but I hadn't actually managed a lot of food waste all in one place on my own before I started this project. And eventually we got really good at managing it without any odors. But I will say there was one time early on where I turned a compost bin and it smelled awful. I mean, we released so many terrible odors, and the neighbor immediately next door was like, this is disgusting. And then another time I decided to cut down these sunflowers because we grew sunflowers to try and help with the soil quality on the lot or in the early days, and they just were everywhere and taking over. And so I decided to cut down some, and a neighbor was really upset that I had cut down his sunflowers without asking. So in both of those cases, what I learned is how, to the point of turning a negative into a positive, when it's happening, you can sometimes want to just close in and like avoid it, and you're like, ultimately I'm doing this for a reason. I'm doing this, like my reasons are right, and just to avoid the conflict. But I've actually found that, especially in the case of odors, I went right over to his house. I sat with him and I said, I am so sorry. This is my fault, but ultimately this is why we're doing this. And these odors will go away in a few minutes, and I will make sure that it never happens again. And then he ended up being a major proponent of the garden. He even turned compost bins in the future. So you can turn those conversations around. I would just say don't avoid them, and try to meet them head on. Try to have conversations with people so you can overcome conflict.
The next question is from Kristen Ross, and it's directed at Louise. So how did you first start spreading the word about what you wanted to do on the lot to get neighbor awareness and interest in volunteering? Did you go door to door? Did you know your neighbors already?
All of it. I didn't know any of my neighbors, and now to this day, even though I don't live in the neighborhood, I'm still really close with a lot of them. I didn't know a single person. We had moved into this block, and we went door to door. We talked to every single person we were lucky that the lot was on a corner and on a sort of relatively well-trafficked corner. So every person who walked by, I waved at. I said, hey, do you want to come in? Do you want to see the space? All of those notes about making sure your gates are open. And I really love the power of handmade signs, because people know that a human's behind that. as opposed to in this stage of way too much advertising information. Seeing a handmade sign, I think that really stands out. We did also flyer all of the sort of business corridors in the area. And then lastly, I would say that's where the programming really came in. We did a lot of block parties and events that we, showcased different local talent, whether it was music or there was a culinary arts group, whatever. And it just allowed us to open up doorways to different audiences. Oh, and kids really, like we went and presented at a local school, and it was just one first grade class, but every single one of them, well, I would say maybe that's optimistic, but I would say the majority of the students then ended up bringing their parents by the garden because it was just a few blocks from their school.
And then I guess I'll say we came, because of the nature of how we chose our sites, we ended up not knowing the neighbors in a lot of cases. And that's where we really relied on community partners and liaisons. So it's difficult to build trust in general. It's difficult to, even though we were engaged in neighborhoods over a period of years, in some cases that's still not long enough in neighborhoods that have gone through decades of disinvestment, who are used to outsiders coming in and doing whatever they want and then leaving. And we found it more beneficial to develop strong ties with a community partner that had that good street cred within a neighborhood. And the downside of that is that you're putting that credibility of the liaison at risk also. They have a lot of trust invested in neighborhood, and that can't be used lightly. Let's see, there's a quick question here. We are still taking your questions if you'd like to write in. There's a question about corner lots and whether corner lot activation is usually has better impact than the center of the block. For the Vacant to Vibrant project, we did find that corner lots tend to be spaces that asked for use in some way. We also found that their land use histories tend to be more complicated because corner lots were also attractive for gas stations and dry cleaners in their histories, and the lot contamination that can persist from those land uses can be a real problem for the types of green land uses that we're talking about. Anyone else want to add to that?
I'd say that, with in my experience, corner lots are great when you want it to be a community messaging board and want it to be, it just, I think, depends on how you're actually going about it. But I think that because it is an intersection and that people see it a lot more, that's where you want to do the majority of your activation. I've seen vacant houses turn into, someone put boards on the side, put chalkboard paint on it, and turned it into that community messaging board so that whenever anyone came by, they knew what was happening in the neighborhood just by going by that house, where, if it was in the center of the block, that would be a lot harder to do. So I think that there's a lot of different ways to utilize that proximity to be able to make sure that you're building a greater community space, whereas center of the block might be better for if you have something that's very central to engaging that block.
Okay. There are questions about the process to acquire land. So what departments do you interact with to give information about acquiring the parcel and land uses that are permissible? In my case, on city-owned land, I worked in cities that had their own land banks. And so there was a process in place, albeit somewhat informal in Gary, to acquire permission to work on that land, but we were operating with temporary lease agreements. So in cases where you're investing a lot of money and time and compost, a lease agreement can leave you to be a little vulnerable. And then, like I mentioned, in Buffalo, we were working on parcels that were owned by the community organization who assumed long-term responsibility and ownership of the parks that we built. So in that case, we worked directly with that landowner, and then we had an MOU in place that dictated what we were responsible for and then what they would be responsible for. Anyone else want to talk about acquiring land?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Detroit we have the largest land bank I think in the country with 97,000 parcels. So that's where majority of the land happens in Detroit. But there's also a really great tool. Loveland Technologies, which is also located here in Detroit, has this website called landgrid.com. So you can figure out who owns most of the land in the country. There's some areas that you can't figure that out, but you can kind of go through and using LandGrid and understand property ownership and who actually owns what land. So just putting a plug in for that.
Yeah, I would. So just a couple notes on New York City specifically. If you're looking for land, sort of from the bird's eye view, I think there's some great organizations like 596 Acres, which have done a tremendous amount of work to map land and who owns it. There are also tools provided by the city planning department that can tell you who owns a property. In our case, we were of this very specific lot that was close to us, and so we used the planning department's maps to figure out who the owner was. And I will say, actually, that was very challenging. It was held under a corporation, which was actually associated with an individual. It took a lot of deep Googling and looking up of records to figure out who that individual was, and then to find contact information was a whole other layer of difficulty. But we discovered he was a doctor, and we made an appointment as patients to go see the doctor, and we were. It felt very much like an exam. The paper crinkling under you as you're sitting on the thing, trying to persuade him that this is a good use of the property. But I think in the case of privately held land, it depends on how that owner wants to sort of lease it to you or donate it to you, and there may be tax or other sort of, I'm not as familiar with this, but I will say one thing that was critical was figuring out what motivates him. Because at first it was a blanket no when I was talking about flowers and, trees and green space. But when we started talking about children and having a place for children to play, and in his case, he's Pakistani. It's a lot of Pakistani families live in very close to the garden. It was very important for him that community had access to this space, and then we could go deeper in the conversation and ultimately get access because we discovered that motivation.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to everyone who came and participated. We have more good questions. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. So we do have, I think our contact information is available, and we'll continue to answer questions in this platform. And maybe those will get to you. So thank you so much for your participation. Thank you to the panelists, Joe and Louise, and also to Jen and Island Press and ioby for putting this together. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.